kick it off. And apart from saying we are so looking forward to hearing you and Brian on our Irish webinar, I don't know what it is that creates so much excitement when people talk about Irish research, but it certainly does. So your first webinar, which is Finding Women in the Records, why do you think it's important that people watch that one? What are they going to get from it?
Good question. I think at any given point in history, women and girls make up half the population, but they don't make up half the documents. Women and girls aren't well documented in the historic records. They probably make up less than half of the records that survive. I think most of what we know about women's lives is shaped by a minority of elite women. And most of them probably lived lives of quiet domesticity. And once they die, their lives fade from view. But there's much less surviving documentation for non-elite women and girls, even though their lives were probably more broadly representative of women's experience. And the reason why I hope people will watch the webinar on tracing Irish women in the records, is to try and recover, to basically equip themselves with the skills to find these women's stories. Because if you don't follow up on women's narratives, you're losing half of your family narrative. You're losing half the story. Susie, a couple of years back, almost 10 years ago now, I traced Tom Cruise's family history and I presented it to him. And do you know that the Cruise name is actually on one of the maternal lines? So if we hadn't actually traced the maternal, if we hadn't actually traced the women's lines as well as the men's, we could have given him certainly a family history, but it wouldn't have been the complete Cruise family history. So if you don't trace the women, if you don't chercher la femme, you're going to lose out on half of the stories.
It's a fascinating way to look at it. And it's so true, your comments on how little is documented. But obviously, if you're doing this webinar, you're saying it's not impossible to find records. It's just not as easy and not as readily accessible.
That's the case. Women's social and economic and their legal status was subordinate to that of men. Women would have been defined by their familial relationship to the male head of household, as mother, as wife, as daughter, as sister. Women who lived outside of the family group would have been defined by usually their economic relationship to the head of household, as a servant or a maid or an employee. So yes, it is harder. There's more work involved in tracing women and finding women in the records. But in my experience, it is so much worth the extra trek to try and find out more about these women in the past.
Terrific. Well, you've got me sold on lining up to watching that webinar as well. So the next one that you're doing, the evidence in death, tell me a bit about why that is so important and why people should be watching that one.
Well, Susie, I think The webinar on evidence and death, I developed it over a number of years. In our lifetimes, most of us leave a very light paper trail. We leave the greatest amount of evidence at key moments: births, marriage, and death. But as a researcher, I'm continuously working to commission to trace people's ancestral families. And I realized that there was actually a greater amount of evidence, that ironically, people sometimes left the greatest amount of evidence in death. And in Ireland, it's said that the Irish do death well. Death is actually one of the busiest times of life. It has its own ceremonies. It has its own rituals. And they involved the person who was dying or who died and their family, their closest friends, their community. And in this webinar, I bring people through the different stages, the person dying, and how the family and friends and community respond to that death. Step by step. And I see what evidence was made, what evidence survives that we can use now, that we can tap for family history. One of the key methodologies in family history is that there's often such little evidence surviving that we really need to examine all sources, no matter how slight the evidence. And sometimes we're parsing the evidence, we're looking for just that extra key fact that will allow us to make a connection. A family connection, that somebody is the brother or the sister, a sibling of somebody else, or a cousin, or an aunt or an uncle. So we're sifting the evidence, looking for small nuggets. And I've consistently found over 25 years that extensive paper trail, I think of it almost as the trail that a comet leaves in the sky. There's much more evidence that survives in and around death. And in the webinar, I show people what survives, where to find it, and how to perhaps sift it to squeeze those last details from the sources.
And Fiona, do you find that as time goes on, we're still getting new records becoming available? Or is it records that have always been there if we've had the time to search personally, but they're becoming more available as digital records? What's the general feel?
Susie, there's a huge amount of records that are available now. When I started off more than 25 years ago, I remember attending a conference in Boston in the US, and a lady asked me, how can you research family history in Ireland when all the records were destroyed? Because that's what she knew about Irish research, the one core fact that she had. And in fact, yes, we lost a huge amount of our archival record. We lost almost the entire 19th century census of Ireland. We lost our wills and testamentary records. But there are other records. At this point in time, there are hundreds of millions of Irish records have been digitized and indexed. The indexing is very important. It means that they're searchable, and they've been published online. And in fact, the company that Brian and I set up, Enaclan, was one of the cornerstones to digitizing these records. And Brian has subsequently moved on to Find My Past and works with them. Find My Past is the largest collection of Irish records online. And it is possible to use records if we move outside the genealogy mindset the births, marriages, and deaths. It's almost like stamp collecting. And if we begin to look at what other evidence is there for our ancestors' lives, if we widen it to look at records like the petty sessions records, petty sessions would have been the lowest courts of the land. All human life is brought before the petty sessions courts in the 19th century. Other sources that I love, in Ireland, we've learned to think laterally and to look at other records as census substitutes. So land records, for example, can make an excellent census substitute. The Valuation Office archives, 1830 to 1865, provide documentation for every household in Ireland in that key generation before and during the famine. And they include cottiers. These are the laborers who held their land not by a rent, but by their labor, by their work. So even the people on the lowest rung of the social scale, we do find their households documented there. And I think there's a growing realization, we've had a fabulous, could you almost call it a renaissance in the last 20 years in Irish family history, a realization that it is possible to trace the Irish roots of the Cushwinter. That's an Irish word. It means the people on foot, the ordinary Joe and Josephine. But it's possible to trace these families. You don't have to be from the great and the good to be able to find records for your Irish family history.
And Fiona, I'm guessing that that's the area that Brian's going to be covering in his webinar of tracing the Irish poor.
Susie, that's exactly what Brian is going to be tracing. When we got involved in Irish genealogy, when we got involved in Irish family history, we wanted to move beyond the people who had coats of arms and left registered pedigrees in the genealogical office, the former Herald's office. Everybody has a family story that is worth knowing, documenting, and keeping for posterity. And that's very much the approach we wanted to make to family history. In our research, and particularly Brian's approach in finding records and licensing them and making them available, we wanted to open up access so that everybody, whether you are Australian aristocracy, as Jack Thompson described himself, descended from somebody transported from Ireland to Australia, or a bounty immigrant, or a free settler. Everybody should have the tools to be able to trace their family. And of course, given the distance between Australia and Ireland, the greatest difficulty has always been accessing the records. So it's one of the huge advantages about having digital records published online.